So many thanks for joining today's webinar on publishing non-fiction books for the general reader, hosted by the Learning Society of Wales's Early Career Researchers Network. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all, and we are very pleased to have two excellent speakers here today to deliver the workshop. A very warm welcome to our fellow Professor Hanna Diamond, who is Professor Emerita of French History at Cardiff University, and a really warm welcome as well to Joanna Godfrey, who is Senior Commissioning Editor at Yale University Press London. Without further delay, I'd like to hand over the session to our speakers, and we will start with Jo. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, it's great to be here today. Let me just pull up my notes. So as Barbara said, my name is Joanna Godfrey and I commission modern history and current affairs titles at Yale University Press London. It's really great to be here today. I'm very grateful to Barbara and the team at the Learning Society of Wales for this invitation to talk about publishing for the general reader. So the books that I commission in Yale's London office are aimed primarily at non-specialists. That is the type of publishing commonly referred to as trade books. As a university press, we peer review all of our books at both proposal and manuscript stage, but our intended readership is not primarily the academic community. We're publishing first and foremost for general readers. I'm therefore actively looking for books which combine the best and most original scholarship with accessible and engaging writing on subjects of broad audience appeal. My background is primarily in history publishing, but most of the lessons here will be applicable across a range of non-fiction subjects. So over the next 15 minutes or so, I will cover the following four topics. Firstly, understanding audience appeal. Secondly, writing strategies for the general reader. Third, building a public-facing platform and engaging with media. And four, just briefly, on peer review considerations. So our first key question is, what is audience appeal and why is this important? Put simply, when publishing trade books, the model relies on selling many more copies than for an academic monograph. The retail price of trade books is lower, and trade editors generally work on fewer books per year than their academic equivalents. For these reasons, the business model relies on a trade book selling many thousands of copies rather than hundreds. So we need to be confident of broad audience appeal, or what we term the market. This is identifying the type of reader we expect to buy our books, finding the right avenues to reach them, and determining what factors are likely to lead them to buy a book in print, ebook, or audio format, or to borrow it from their local public library. We know that there are certain subjects within history which are perennially popular with readers, and you can identify those by going into your local independent bookshop or branch of Waterstones. In my subject area, World War II is an area of ongoing interest, and one which shows no sign of slowing down. We also know there's huge interest in the Tudors, spies and intelligence, and history of crime tend to be popular too. And we've seen that playing out in the world of podcasts recently as well. Other subjects come in and out of fashion, often depending on other cultural events. So, for example, the success of Bridgerton and the recent Jane Austen anniversary has seen a spike of interest in the 18th century. Game of Thrones and similarly early medieval tinged dramas have seen an interest in the Viking and Saxon periods. When looking for a subject to write on, ideally you identify a gap in the market, so a subject which hasn't been published on for a little while. You don't, for example, want to be competing with a very recent book by a very big name author. And you want to identify your USPs or unique selling points. It might be that you have a new argument about your subject, which fundamentally forces a reassessment of that period in question, or it may be that you're viewing a subject through a different prism than that through which it has traditionally been seen. So in history publishing, we've seen examples recently of people's history, which take more of a bottom-up, everyday or social history approach to a subject, or books which centre big historical events through the eyes of women. A great example of this sort of approach is Harry Rubenhold's The Five, which looks at the curiously still popular subjects of Jack the Ripper, but through the eyes of his victims. Trade publishers and literary agents can help you to craft or refine your USPs into a convincing proposal or pitch, but it's good for you to have an idea of what is unique in your research in order to grab the attention of a publisher or agent in the first place. Just sticking with history for a moment, some areas of history can be a bit trickier. I would say microhistory is generally challenging unless you have a hugely original set of sources and a really outstanding writing style. A good example of a recent very successful book is Malcolm Gaskell's The Ruin of All Witches. But of course, he already had a very strong trade publishing platform, and witches is another of those subjects which is perennially popular. A traditional cradle-to-grave biography can also be quite tricky, though more modern forms of life writing, such as partial biography, which just focuses on a short section of someone's life, or group biography can be very successful. Generally, you want as broad a scope as possible. Unfortunately, a book about Pembrokeshire in the space of just a couple of decades is unlikely to appeal to a large enough audience. And of course, where possible, you want to appeal to an international audience. So books which will reach beyond the UK into markets like Europe, the US, and Australia are especially promising. Look for subjects which have drama, excellent sources, ideally with many engaging human voices, and something surprising to say. As publishers, we wear many different hats every single day of the week, but one of the most important is that we're fundamentally salespeople. We have to convince people to buy these books, and so the bigger the potential market, the better. You can learn more about the market, as I say, by spending time in your local bookshops, as well as looking at the topics which are drawing conversation and debate on the many podcasts that we have now on social media and in popular magazines like For History, BBC History Extra, and History Today. These all provide a good guide for what general readers are interested in, but remember you need to find your own unique selling points and weigh into that subject. As a case study, I'll just briefly look at Hannah's very brilliant recent book, Josephine Baker's Secret War, which she's going to talk about in more detail, but I will touch on very briefly. I was attracted to this project for a number of reasons, but I'll just look at two in particular. First, as I've already mentioned, we know that there is a strong reader interest in World War II, and the subject of espionage and special operations is one of the most popular parts of the field. In recent years, we've seen more interest in the subject of women in intelligence, which is being increasingly researched and published on. Secondly, we knew that there was also a lot of interest in Josephine Baker, particularly in the US, but also increasingly in the UK and Europe. But what is known about her to date has mostly been related to her work as an entertainer in interwar Paris or her post-war life, including her advocacy for civil rights. Her wartime service had been rather understudied so far, so Hannah's work filled a clear gap in the market. So we had here an enticing combination of Josephine Baker, a household name, coupled with an enduring popular interest in World War II intelligence. Okay, next we're going to look at writing strategies for general readers. When you're pitching a trade book, the publisher is generally going to want to see an example of your writing for a general readership. So it's worth thinking a bit at the outset about what good writing looks like. And I've got 3 tips for you here. Firstly, the best way to become a better writer, and I really can't stress this enough, is by reading widely, not just in your subject area, but as broadly as you can. I would especially check out prize-winning non-fiction books, so the type of books that you will find on the Baillie Gifford Women's Prize for Non-Fiction and Orwell Prize longlists. Audiobooks definitely count, so if you're pushed for time, which I know we all are, just stick on an audiobook while you're driving or doing your chores. Pay attention to what you enjoy in the writing. What is keeping you listening or turning the pages? What are you drawn to as a reader? Is it the characters, the description of the setting, the argument, or something else? All of this is important when it comes to your own writing. Secondly, once you start writing, it can be helpful to have an idea of a specific target reader in mind. This could be a friend or a family member who you know is interested in your research but has very little prior knowledge of the subject. So if you were going to talk to them about your research, what language would you use? How would you keep them interested? What questions would they ask you about your research? Thirdly, and I'm sure that if you're teaching currently, you say this to your students all the time, read your writing out loud. It can sound crazy, but it's the best way of hearing what is working and what isn't. You'll instantly be able to spot which sentences are too long or where material isn't as clear as it could be. Since popular history is increasingly consumed in audio format, this is the success of podcasts and increasingly audiobooks, it will also give you a nice preview of what your book will sound like when it's recorded further down the line. Right, now we're going to look at building a public-facing platform and engaging with the media. This is actually an area that is somewhat easier than it used to be, as there are so many opportunities to get your voice heard, whether it is via social media, podcasts, or the burgeoning history and literary event space. We don't require authors to be on social media. I think it's something that's only really worth doing if it's something you enjoy or feel comfortable with. If it is something that appeals, then we recommend that you choose a platform that you enjoy and work to build up a following there. For popular history, it changes all the time, but the best platforms at the moment are Instagram and TikTok. For academic history, there's a lot of good conversations happening on Blue Sky and some on X as well. Some of our authors that have particularly good followings on social media are Helen Fry, Catherine Carter, Steve Tibble, and Tom Smith. So do have a look at what they're doing and see what you can emulate. Other things that you can do are seeking out podcasts that might be looking for interviewees. Of course, you'll likely have to start with the smaller ones, but once you're well known for your style, the possibilities are endless. Or you can volunteer to do public-facing writing for outlets like The Conversation or BBC History. It's always helpful to build up your public speaking experience, so do take opportunities to do events and sit on panels. All of this helps, both when a publisher is considering your book, but also further down the line when it comes to publication. Finally, if you're based in a university, have a chat with your institution's press office. A part of their role is generally promoting the university's research to the media, so it may be that they can help you to make some connections and further build your profile. So finally, I'll touch briefly on peer review considerations. As I said at the outset, we peer review our projects at both proposal and at manuscript stage. This is quite unusual in trade publishing. Generally, if you publish with a trade house, somewhere like Penguin or HarperCollins, there won't be a formal peer review element to the process. So if this is important to you, you might think about looking at a university press, which also publishes trade books. So like us, Manchester, Bristol, or local to you all, the very brilliant University of Wales Press in Cardiff. We do tell our reviewers when we're doing peer review that our books are designed for general readers, and we ask them to review the proposal or manuscript with that in mind, i.e. not in the same way they would review an academic monograph. In the vast majority of cases, we find that this works very well. I will stop at that point. There's a lot more that I could say, but I will be very happy to answer any questions in the Q&A at the end of the session.
Thank you so much, Jo. That was a very comprehensive overview and really interesting information you shared with us. I would encourage attendees to pop in their questions on the chat. We will invite you to the Q&A to raise these questions. In the meantime, I'd really like to hand over to Professor Hannah Diamond.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Jo, for those lovely words about the book, which I'm going to talk about now. So bear with me, I have got a few things for you to look at. I will just get my PowerPoint up on the screen. Hopefully we're there now. Is that okay, Barbara? Yes, good, great. So just to pick up on sort of experiencing some of the things that Jo has talked to you about here, I published last spring my book about Josephine Baker's Secret War, and I have to say that Yale have been wonderful publishers to work with. I had a very different experience from other academic publishers that have also been very excellent in their way, but because Yale is a trade publisher, Jo was much more available to me and was able to help me craft the book that Josephine Baker's Secret War became. In fact, Jo reached out to me in the very early days, right at the beginning of the project, as I recall. I was lucky enough to be awarded a Leverhulme Fellowship for 2 years to do the research for the book, and it coincided with President Macron deciding that Josephine Baker should be a national hero by having her ashes transferred to the very male mausoleum in central Paris, and there was a lot of press interest around that time, and The Guardian actually published an article about my forthcoming research, which Jo picked up on. Now, Josephine Baker, I am, as you may have cottoned on, historian of Second World War France, with particular interest actually in individual lives and women's experience. And I came across Josephine Baker because I was commissioned to do some research about her. And to my horror, I knew about her coming to Paris, African-American woman, came to Paris at 1925, literally exploded onto the Paris music hall scene. She danced, actually in a very, not very many clothes, in quite a provocative way, and became a kind of overnight success. And I think of her as being one of our first celebrities, had a very big following in interwar Paris, very important figure in bringing Black culture to French and European audiences, bettered herself. But what I didn't know about was this extraordinary story of the work she did helping the Allies and working for the resistance during the Second World War. So when I realized this being my field, after all, I decided that I wanted to try and delve a bit deeper. Now, there are a lot of books, a lot of very scholarly and important books about Josephine Baker. The first three you can see here deal very much with her performativity, the way in which she was received by Parisian audiences. She tapped into the French obsession about the colonial other, as scholars have called it. And you can see here also that very famous banana skirt that was fashioned for her to accentuate those extraordinary movements of her interpretation of the Charleston. So there was a lot of scholarly writing here about that side of her work. And also her post-war, in the post-war period, she became very caught up in anti-racist activity and would go on to become quite a key figure in the American civil rights movement. And she adopted what would be 12 children and took them to her chateau in the Dordogne as a kind of living experiment to show the world that everyone could live together, whatever the colour of their skin and their cultural background. But what was missing in this scholarly work, which was quite a remarkable oversight really, was this Second World War period. And that was the area that I decided I wanted to delve into. There were lots of stories and write a book about it. Now, having identified the gap, I then had to uncover the material. And I did do really quite a huge amount of research trying to follow the archive trail in France. And thanks to the pantheonization, this celebration of Josephine Baker's life, a lot of archives came to the forefront that hadn't been really looked at before. I also spent some time in the US and I looked at collections of Josephine Baker's letters and writings, collections that have been put together about her life. And also in the UK, Josephine Baker did a lot of concert entertainment during the war, and there were some archives of those activities in the National Archives here. I also found press archives to be very helpful. Josephine Baker liked nothing better than to sit down with a journalist and talk about what she was doing. So press archives, articles about her, particularly the African American press, for whom she was a huge icon, of course, very successful, first Black film star, female film star, followed her activities very closely. Now, once I got all this material, I populated a very large Excel file, which allowed me to locate where she was and when, and what the sources told me about her, also what she said about it. She did write some autobiographical pieces, and helped me to fashion a narrative. And really, I think with Jo, we felt that that was what would draw in the general reader. It is the most extraordinary story. I won't go into it in detail, but you're very welcome to get a copy. But she used her celebrity as a cover to transmit and collect intelligence. Like her celebrity, nobody ever really suspected this actually rather eccentric entertainer, and she was able to move around during this time of war when borders were shut, and she also had access to people in the know. So here you can see how we tried to put this into a story that we could tell the general reader while also keeping the scholarly approach. So here you can see my contents page. Now, for this kind of trade book, unlike history books that would focus perhaps on historical debates and discussions, I pushed all those historical debates into the introduction and the afterword, so that the story of Josephine Baker's war is predominantly chronological. As you can see here, the chapters, setting her up, how she became an intelligence agent, right through to her experiences when she was actually taken on by the French army, named as a sub-lieutenant for the auxiliary French Air Force based in North Africa. And as you can see here, Josephine Baker did spend the vast majority of the war period in North Africa, working first to help the Allies and then focus more directly on de Gaulle's Free French resistance movement, providing information, informing, all the while using her celebrity as a cover, entertaining, meeting people in the know, passing on this valuable information. Now, after the war, this after section was very important for me to show the key argument of my book, which is that without understanding Josephine Baker's war, we can't really understand her life subsequently, i.e. this argument that she came to see her own platform as being incredibly valuable to promote the ideas she believed in. During the war, she was a very ardent Gaullist, she adored de Gaulle, and she did much work promoting him. And after the war, the beginnings of her anti-racist activity. And I talk very much also in the afterword, which is, if you like, I think my scholarly contribution, as it were, and some reviewers of my book have picked up on this, the memorialization of Josephine Baker, how this wartime period was very much overlooked in the memorialization, and how Macron used her in this pantheonization process as a way, if you like, crudely put, of extending his electorate. She very much ticked those diversity boxes, if you like, and she chose France. She chose to come and live in France and stay in France. Hence, she was very supportive of Republican ideals. So once also wanting to give you a sense of how this research I was able to promote it to audiences perhaps beyond academia, as Jo has mentioned. I found that even before the book came out, partly because of this pantheonization process, there was a lot of interest in the work I did. I contributed to Women on the Front Line, which was a documentary by Channel 4, and the importance of this, the importance of making these connections with the media, is that you can, in ref terms, I suppose, have an impact, change those producers' understandings of Josephine Baker and change those documentary products that they had in mind. Similarly, in France, you can see here, I have done several, of which these are 2 radio documentaries, which are now podcasts, by putting back into the centre of Josephine Baker's life this wartime period. And here you can see these episodes on La Résistante, 2 podcast projects, one here by France Culture, which is loosely the equivalent of Radio 4, and another France Inter on Josephine Baker. And here you can see her in her uniform. Also, I worked with Duolingo, who put together a 12 podcast series of the story of Josephine Baker's life through very simple French to help French learners through their interest in Josephine Baker's story, to have something to listen to. And here you can see episode 100. They did many episodes on her life. And I also did a podcast with an American production company that made this story about Josephine Baker for children. And it was a kind of drama uncovering her life, and I had to be the expert who was helping some young spies along. So these various ways of reaching people across I would say, the English and French-speaking world. I also I found a lot of interest in museums, once again, particularly in France, and I'm going soon to the US also to do a few museum talks. Once the book came out, I benefited hugely from the wonderful publicist at Yale, who line me up to do book talks, to talk at some book festivals. I have to say the book festival circuit is much more difficult now. There's less money around. A lot of it has gone online, and the existing festivals are very engaged in celebrities, but there were some that were interested in Josephine. Also, I did some online lectures and the many podcasts, which I'm actually still doing, still taping podcasts, things like History Extra, this very interesting one, History Rage, which is a very enjoyable history one. And of course, the Second World War, there seems to be an unlimited interest in that. And at this stage, nearly a year on from the book, I find that I've sort of moved into another phase of dissemination, which is academic audiences. I'm doing a lot of talks. A couple of weeks ago in Bristol, I'm going up to Manchester, and I'm doing really talking about the process of the research and the process of putting the book together. And so I think, and there are ongoing projects that I'm not at liberty to talk about in detail, having signed NDA agreements, but possibly these will come to fruition. Who knows? The money is very scarce in the TV and film world these days, but there is a documentary film project and a feature film, and maybe even an exhibition in the works. So all this can be seen and may well come together as the basis for a REF impact case study, if I am able to track through and provide the evidence for change. And I'm advised also that these kinds of scholarly based trade books, which do not fall under the needs of open access, can be put forward for the REF and can score very highly. So if you have any questions, please do come back to me later on, but I will stop there for now. And hopefully we can return to, if I can get rid of this for you, sorry.
I think we can see you now. So the presentation is gone, Hannah. Thank you so much. It was such a brilliant and inspirational talk. Really nice to hear about how you went through, crafting, finding the gap, the market, and also finding the argument for your book. Really inspiring and very, also informative in terms of thinking beyond the readers of the book, right? Like all the podcast, book festivals, and all the engagement that you have had with the media is definitely something to consider. So thank you very much for that really inspiring talk. So